Hello everyone, I'm Nevis Teresi, moderator for TESOL Italy, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of TESOL Italy's 47th convention. Our speaker for this session is Joshua Nelson. Joshua is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and he is an associate professor of English at the University of Oklahoma, specializing in American Indian literature and film. He has written about Cherokee literature and identity and substantially contributed to the PBS documentary Searching for Sequoia. He is currently directing a documentary on American Indians in the 45th Infantry Division during World War II. The title of Joshua's session is Indigenous Inventions and Interventions, Fourth World Literature and Film. Joshua, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Molte grazie agli organizzatori per avermi invitato e grazie a tutti voi per essere venuti. And if it's okay with that, I will stop trying to pronounce Italian and I'll stick to English, at which I am significantly better. So let's maybe just get underway with a accompanying slideshow here as we think about some ways that we might be able to incorporate Indigenous content, especially short films, and literature into some of your teaching. And this plays better with a live audience among people, but I think it's still a nice introduction. So let's just take a quick look at this short.
What are we? Werewolf thoughts.
All right. So that comes to us from a graduate and alum of the University of Oklahoma, Stephen Paul Judd. And you can find that there. And I'm happy to share this slideshow with all of the participants later on. So you don't need to worry about screenshotting or anything like that. But of course, you're welcome to. Judd comes out of Oklahoma. He's a Kiowa and Choctaw filmmaker. And he's long made a habit of these kinds of pop cultural combinations in American Indian film and as a visual artist too. So a nice intro, I hope. But maybe as a broader intro, it might be worth thinking about what's the point of studying American Indian literature and film. Thankfully, with a group of educators, I think I don't need to go too far into the value of diverse content in our curriculum. So I feel like for the most part, I'm preaching to the choir, but there are some particular things about American Indian content that might be valuable. One of the foremost among those is the idea of a kind of a looking glass for the white man, to borrow a phrase from the title of a piece by a Pequot preacher from the 19th century, William Apess, in the 1830s. He was writing about how it is that from a marginal position, we can perhaps see things that a mainstream culture cannot see about itself. And in the Indigenous context, part of what it is that I think we can see and help the mainstream see about itself is the way in which identities get constructed, or as I've alluded to here, how it is that the sausage is made, if by sausage we're okay referring to people. But the idea is that, as I'm sure you're familiar with, societies construct us. Our identities precede us. We step into them preformed. And so we might imagine, nevertheless, that somehow doesn't quite apply to us as individuals. It's always a little bit uncomfortable confronting this idea that we are not discrete individuals, but rather are people who are put together in time and in place by forces outside of our control. Those forces have rhetorical aims, right? The US in particular, for instance, likes to imagine itself and talk about itself as a place where you can be self-made. You can create your own sort of world, and the benefits that would come to you accrue through your labor. The structure of the US is rhetorically at least designed to help that kind of autonomy prosper. There are limits, however, to that. And so when I talk here about the limits of restraint, part of what we see is that the government in particular, it's worth acknowledging at the outset, has a complicated and oftentimes ugly history vis-a-vis indigenous peoples in the US. And so the government has sometimes failed to restrain itself relative to indigenous peoples in the way that it would restrain itself when dealing with members of the mainstream. And so when I talk about the limits of restraint, that's what I'm alluding to. For instance, the Cherokee people, after being removed from our homelands in the southeastern part of the United States, bought the country that we moved to in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. We bought it outright. We bought it in fee simple. And yet, when the Dawes Act rolls around, I'll talk about that in a second, that didn't matter. We were not able to hold on to that land. And how it is that that's the case is an important question that students of American Indian history, literature, and film should take up. More broadly, though, part of what we get to see are new ways of thinking about big questions. Questions like death, questions like how to live our lives in the face of it, and the point of living our lives. So these grand questions that we take on as humanities instructors all can be approached from novel and, I think, intriguing angles, looking at them from indigenous perspectives. So for me, some of those big values that get built into the study have to do with non-coercion, how it is that we rule without pressuring people or forcing them into following our lead, how consensus can help form the basis of that kind of community, even ways that we would challenge convention or challenge community-based rule. Indigenous communities have models for this. Similarly, how it is that we relate to place and to the people that occupy it is an ongoing theme in a great deal of indigenous literature. So superintendents, particularly of land, and I'll turn my attention to land in just a couple of seconds. How it is that we take care of the land or superintend it, how we provide for it and ensure that the folks who follow us will have access to it is an overriding theme in indigenous literature and film. This extends to all sorts of things, right? It's a giant body of work. And so whatever it is that you're looking to highlight thematically in your curriculum, there's room to include indigenous content. So that includes commentary on governance, on local sovereignty particularly. So one of the places that the US has done better than it historically did was in propagating opportunities for local self-governance. Women's power shows up in important ways in indigenous lit. The ways that we make art, the ways that we make film, and among all, as we think about these kind of interlaced values and practices, this is the sort of Bourdieuian foundation of my critical work, is how it is that we achieve a balance among all of these sometimes competing forces or competing values. So that as a kind of a meta value is one of the most important, I think, that we could explore in Indigenous content. So let me offer a little bit of quick background in dealing with United States Indigenous policy. And I promise not to bore you. I'm going to move out of this quickly. And again, maybe you could just take a mental note of this page to move forward. In general, what we see in all of this policy business is a kind of an oscillation of federal policy revolving around a kind of antagonism to Indigenous cultures, and then a slightly more ambivalent antagonism, if you will, that has to do very much with assimilationist policies. So the idea being, on one hand, that, say, during the Civilization Act era of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, that American Indian people would be folded in to the main body politic, or that they might be either actively warred against, as with the Plains Wars of the 1860s, 70s, or entirely removed from the American body politic to remote places far out west, or isolated on reservations. This has gone back and forth in American Indian federal policy for decades. Gratefully, after a great deal of this, when we see, for instance, we could spend hours on this page, so I better not. What we see finally now is the era that we're in, the self-determination era, which is roughly starting around 1975 with the Indian Education and Self-Determination Act that gave American Indian nations control over their own policies and their own self-governance, right? So nowadays, Indian nations in the US run their own schools, we run our own hospitals, our healthcare services, our law enforcement apparatuses, our courts, our legislative and executive and judicial branches. So anything that American Indian people have the capacity to take on, they can now, aided through resources established by treaty obligations by the federal government. So we're dealing with a very diverse population here. There are over 500 tribes in the US. There are almost 40 in Oklahoma alone. Each of these tribes frequently has their own language. Certainly, they have their own culture and their own histories. So it's really difficult to generalize about American Indian people in the United States, right? We're talking about an extremely diverse set of folks, about 4 million of them in the US, roughly 2% of the total population. So that is difficult to generalize, doesn't stop me from generalizing for the sake of helping you to include some things in your syllabus. Probably the place that you want to start if we're dealing with American Indian folks is around attitudes towards land. By land, I should clarify, I mean that in a very broad metaphorical sense, really to talk about the importance of place and where it is that we find ourselves. On that point, the noted and probably preeminent American Indian political philosopher Vine Deloria Jr. said this: "This tradition tells us that there are places of unquestionable inherent sacredness on this earth, sites that are holy in and of themselves. People have been commanded to perform ceremonies at these holy places so that the earth and all its forms of life might survive and prosper. Yet the ceremonies have little to do with individual or tribal prosperity. Their underlying theme is gratitude expressed by human beings on behalf of all forms of life." And I don't know very many folks who would disagree with that. So I just want to make sure that things are working okay on the chat there. It looks like we're doing all right. Yeah. That pretty tidily sums up, to my mind, how it is that land figures in the sacred imaginations of American Indian folks, culturally speaking. So that's one of the important things that we see here, is that land, according to Deloria, relative to Native people, is not some fuzzy, warm, embracey kind of thing. It's a very specific thing. It's very much about ceremonial practices. And they're talking about not just land in general, like we hear people say, Native Americans are so close to the land. Well, yeah, but they're really much closer to very particular places. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. If you were teaching American Indian literature, I would encourage you to take a very strong look at this book, The Way to Rainy Mountain, by N. Scott Momaday. This fellow won the Pulitzer for a book we'll talk about in a minute. But here he talks about this attitude towards land. East of my grandmother's house, the sun rises out of the plain. Once in his life, a man ought to concentrate his mind upon the remembered earth, I believe. He ought to give himself up to a particular landscape in his experience, to look at it from as many angles as he can, to wonder about it, to dwell upon it. He ought to imagine that he touches it with his hands at every season and listens to the sounds that are made upon it. He ought to imagine the creatures there and all the faintest motions of the wind. He ought to recollect the glare of noon and all the colors of the dawn and dusk. So this is a really beautiful short novel. It's only 100 and some pages. They're very brief passages where we see him narrating place as well as anyone that I know of in this kind of biographical rumination, where we see this intricate weaving of three voices, mythical, ethnological, and historical or personal. And if you teach the book, you'll see that towards the end, all of these three start to blend together and become indistinguishable, providing a really nicely kind of holistic look at how it is that all of these voices matter to the construction of identity. Thinking about land, we've got a short film here by Cherokee animator Joseph Erb called We Prayed in Water. I've edited this down pretty significantly, so it looks a little choppy, but give it a chance here, and we'll see what it is that he has to say for us about a more political take on relationships to land. All right, this is, I think, is a very cool piece. I think you see clearly enough that it's a commentary on oil extraction. This matters especially in Oklahoma with the advent of fracking, a process whereby high injection wells shoot a variety of chemicals and waters into the fractures well underneath the earth to help draw more oil out. We discovered in Oklahoma that we've got a lot of fault lines in the state. So we have a lot of earthquakes there. They're usually so mild that you never feel them. But when we started fracking in these areas, those earthquakes intensified significantly. So people were feeling them all over the state. Extractive industry said, no, there's no way we're causing that. It kept happening. Damage to buildings was resulting. There were damages to university buildings with, giant cornice pieces falling off. Things were getting pretty dicey around there. Finally, some laws got put into place that said no more fracking around fault lines. And sure enough, the earthquake stopped. And that short film too, there are a few things that we could read culturally if we're looking for them. One is this hat. This is a hat worn by stomp dancers. The stomp dance is the traditional ceremonial cycle of the southeastern tribes, the Cherokee in particular. So we have some pointed commentary here on how it is that extractive resources like oil refining directly impact ceremonial practices of Cherokee people in northeastern Oklahoma. Here we've got another more comedic take on land. This is from a short film called No Reservations by Trevor Carroll, who is an Ojibwe filmmaker. This is a Canadian film. And as it turns out, the Canadians, they make a lot of films. They have a funding structure there that helps them out. But let's just take a quick look at this if we can. Sorry, we don't have it. The premise here of this film is that there is a proposed pipeline that's going to be developed under a suburban neighborhood. There is a clear reference here to the Dakota Access Pipeline and the protests against it, the No DAPL protests. Here we see a kind of a pointed commentary in Carroll's imagination of what a police response might look like were a protest to happen in the suburbs versus a protest out on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. So if you're teaching about some Native films, these are feature-length films that might be up your alley. This one is amazing. If you have time for no other American Indian film, I'd encourage you to make time for this one, Atanajrat the Fast Runner. Now, it's a long one. It's not going to play great for high school audiences. It's about 3 hours, and it is excruciatingly slow at times, just to be completely honest. There are extended passages of people just walking in the snow. So why is it on here? Well, if you get a chance to see it, especially like on a big screen, it is a transformative media experience. It can actually change your ideas about what you think a movie can do. So it's an artistic project, but again, not super user-friendly for most of your high school audiences. The Sun at Midnight is much more user-friendly, and it features a young woman as the protagonist. Sweet Country comes to us from Australia. It is an Aboriginal Western and a really fascinating film. Let me leave Older Than America to the side just for a moment. So thematically speaking, land is usually where I start my syllabi. Next up are identity issues. These are probably your holy three of the American Indian literary Renaissance. Housemaid of Dawn, that wins a Pulitzer in 1969. Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. These two tell the story of World War II vets. Winter in the Blood by James Welch. It's a very bare-knuckled kind of piece about, all of these are actually about young American Indian men who are having trouble fitting into their mainstream societies and, as it goes, into their traditional societies as well. They're mixed blood protagonists. That was a common theme among a lot of those early films, early novels. And I'm trying to be mindful of the time, 11 minutes to go, no problem. So these films, again, are ones that you might include if you're especially interested in identity questions like fitting in, which is certainly going to resonate with several younger audiences. So this one is set out in the wilds. This is another Canadian film set in the far northwest. Four Sheets to the Wind is set in Oklahoma. I'm not sure if you can get to this one. It'd be a good one for youthful audiences. So you might keep an eye on Netflix, where Harjo has several of his films show. This is a beautiful film, The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open. It's a hard film. This is a film about domestic violence, and it's really sometimes excruciating to watch, but it's also beautifully done. It's shot on 16 millimeter film, and it has the editing makes it look like it's done in a single take. It's absolutely one of the most beautiful and touching films I've seen in the past decade, Indigenous or not. I'd really encourage you to get your hands on that one and watch it if you can. Drunktown's Finest, this is a kind of a rough hitter too. This is about young Native folks struggling with cycles of abuse, with substance abuse, with transgender identity issues, and with other broader assimilation issues. This is directed by a Navajo woman, Sydney Freeland, who is herself trans. So this gives us a take on gender that you're not likely to find in very many places. So around these questions of fitting in, the topic of assimilation will show up again and again. Here we've got another Canadian film, but we'll throw it on here anyway. Again, the Canadian funding structure helps them make some really beautiful and hard-hitting narrative films that we don't have as much funding support for in the US. We've got just a clip of this short film, Savage, by Lisa Jackson, who is Anishinaabe.
Papi kiwi.
So the ideological forces represented by boarding schools that were prominent not just in the US and in Canada, but really in places all across the world are the focus of Jackson's work here. But it also reminds us in this kind of pop cultural reference to Michael Jackson's Thriller videos that students are never completely controlled by the institutions that they inhabit to the good, right? So these films are, again, good ones for inclusion. If you're thinking about assimilation and ideology, state apparatuses as part of your curricular focus, rather than read them to you, I'm going to move on in the interest of time. We're thinking about gender, early novels like these, Kajawiya, The Half-Blood by Morning Dove, this is ballpark 1920s. Same with Zekala Shah's American Indian stories. This one works really well. It's very teachable, so you could grab a couple of excerpts out of this one. Show us American Indian women very early on offering up an indigenous voice. But if you're really looking for the best in American Indian content, I think you look to Louise Erdrich. And basically anything by Louise Erdrich is transformative. She is just absolutely brilliant. And how it is that she hasn't won the Nobel yet is beyond me. She's got to win it. There's just no question in my mind. Love Medicine was her first. It's exquisite. It's probably the fourth leg of the American Indian Renaissance, if we're being fair. It just comes a little bit later in the 1980s. But she really hits her stride with this series, The Last Report on the Miracles of Little No Horse, Plague of Doves, and The Night Watchman. So she's winning the Pulitzer here, came right up next to it with Plague of Doves. And this one, I think, won Rats. Nah, maybe it didn't. It's a beautiful book. These are all beautiful books. She reminds me of Faulkner in this kind of interweaving of narrative perspectives and multi-generational histories. And her language is just exquisite. She is out of this world good. Here's a good selection of films that might be up your alley. Sami Blood is a new one coming out of Scandinavia that intersects really nicely with assimilation and with gender. Let's see. These would play really well with young audiences. Heavy metal version of some of those earlier fitting in narratives. This one's tough. Heartberries. This is a picture of a young woman's dealing with, again, cycles of domestic violence, but also demonstrates how it is that she finds healing in art and in writing and a way forward. There is one that everybody's talking about. This is set among urban Native people in the San Francisco Bay Area. So this is a very bare-knuckled look at things. And as it turns out, most of the U.S.'s Native people nowadays live in urban areas and not in rural, and certainly not in reservation settings. So he's kind of changing the direction of what we're doing with American Indian Lit these days. I always want to include a section on humor when I'm teaching about American Indian Lit and film, to remind people that it by no means is all about tragedy among American Indian folks. We are funny and we are happy people. And a lot of these films help us with that. Let me show you a quick clip from Ronnie Bodine, also directed by Stephen Paul Judd, who did the round dance that we started off with. All right, in the interest of time, we'll have to hold off on that. It's a super funny film. It's publicly available. I've got the links to all that. You're by all means invited to go check it out. I think you'll love it. Smoke Signals is probably one of the most famous of American Indian films. Comes out in 1998, based on a short story by Sherman Alexie from 1994, if memory serves. the Lone Ranger and Tano fist fight in heaven. If you're teaching Alexei, who is very funny, you just need to be aware that he has been the subject of some substantiated Me Too sexual harassment allegations. So if I'm teaching Alexei these days, I make the gender politics front and center of the conversations that we're going on to have. So we talk about how it is the masculinity gets constructed, how it is that women are treated in his novels, so or his short stories or poetry or films. So we can still teach his work, but I think we are increasingly cognizant of where it is that he positions himself relative to gender matters. Run out of time. I'm going to have to save that one. It's called Three Little Boys. We'll give you a link to it. It's fantastic. This is the one that everyone is talking about. To get to this, you're probably going to need a VPN and a subscription to Hulu. But this is shot in a tiny town in Oklahoma around Holdenville. It's of the moment. It just got renewed for a third season on FX. Like I say, this is the one that everyone is paying all their attention to in Indian country today. These films all play fantastic. Smoke Signals plays really well. Boy by Taika Waititi out of New Zealand is hysterical, as is Hunt for Wilder People. These are the funniest things around. For high school audiences, stay clear of this. This is a drug comedy that's offensive in about every way it knows how to be offensive. Barking Water is a beautiful film. It's a dark comedy. I think you should know that a lot of American Indian comedy does tend to be dark in a lot of aspects. Death is not all the time tragic. Death is sometimes really comedic. Poverty is the same way. And part of this comes back to these earlier attitudes about interlaced values that I was talking about earlier, especially around balance. For a lot of Indigenous thinking, death and life, happiness and sadness are constitutive outsides. They are the flip side of each other's coin, and they don't exist without the other. So them being one, they belong to each other. And in many ways, that characterizes a great deal of all of these films and novels that I've been urging you to consider. In some ways, it doesn't make a great deal of sense to separate them out thematically, right? Whether they're dealing with land, identity, assimilation, humor, etc. Oftentimes, they all come together. And if we've got time, let me just show you a brief clip of an animated short film from the Haida folks, again, out of Canada, that perhaps draws that together. And I believe that I'm just about out of time. But we have time to do that. Wonderful. So we'll keep this one short. Thank you. right, so what we're seeing here is a animated adaptation of a traditional Haida legend. But notice the ways that it's doing this, right? It's showing us kind of anime-looking characters. It's also showing us how it is that the Haida tell their stories. They tell their stories in weaving, which is what the mouse is doing, right? The mouse is weaving the story that we then get to see. And in those weavings, we see this kind of framing, right? These panels that function like storyboards or comic books. And so the filmmaker here too has incorporated this kind of paneling as a way to show us simultaneous action and differing perspectives. It's a really beautiful and innovative way of reimagining what it is the media can do for American Indian people. So I've hoped to demonstrate to you that Indigenous literature and film has something of what it is, I think, that you're looking for. It is as wide as the world itself. It offers a wealth of cultural perspectives on any of the subjects that demand our attention today. The topics like land, gender, belonging, politics, power, resistance, resilience, all of these are not new topics, right? But the insights that we could gain from looking at them from a marginalized position oftentimes are. And they are as new as they are old. With that, I'll close. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. More about Indigenous history, maybe particularly about the Trail of Tears. Is that right, Lav? Gotcha. Okay. So I think with the Trail of Tears, the best historian is William McLaughlin. And I can type that. Maybe I can type that. Oh, we're running out of time. Okay. Well, I'm not able to type somehow, but that's McLaughlin, William McLaughlin. Absolutely brilliant historian. More broadly, let me think. I don't have that uploaded, but I can, and what I can do is just sort of make it available to you. Except maybe the clips. The clips might be complicated, but yeah, glad to get it to you. Oh, cool. This is what I'm after. And all of the stuff, what I'll do too is I can just like send you all some of the syllabi that I use. So especially in COVID, I had to include publicly available clips, right? So that students can access them on their own. So all of this stuff is out there and free, and people want you to check out the work. So I will gladly get that out to you. And I'll try to think of other sources more broadly on American Indian history, particularly from Indigenous authors that might be valuable as well.
Thank you. Thank you for an amazing session. On behalf of TESOL Italy, I would like to thank Joshua and all the participants for taking part in this session. The next session will be at 5:15 p.m. Certificates of attendance will be available to download from the website at the end of the convention. And perhaps we can ask Joshua to share his presentation later on with the TESOL committee. Thank you.
By all means, grazie mille.
You said that the road to happiness was long and winding. You said that the forest would get dark, and that the ground could shift here upon this hill we're climbing. No matter how close we get, we're still so far. But I trust we'll find the clearing. I'm trusting the trail. No matter what we're feeling, there's one way we can't fail. Let's just keep hiking. Let's plant our feet. Let's just keep hiking. Keep hiking with me. Hold my hand, baby. Keep hiking with me. You said the road up to success was an impossible test unless we had some sort of map. And I could feel it in my chest just as our feet begged us to rest. I think this just might be the end of that. But I said I trust we'll find the clearing. I'm trusting the trail. No matter what we're feeling, there's one way we can't fail. Let's just keep hiking. Let's plant our feet. Let's just keep hiking. Keep hiking with me. Hold my hand.